Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are looking today at Chapter 5, Key Issues 3 and 4, and we're delving a little bit more into language. So today we're looking at why do languages vary among places, and why do languages survive or perish? So what makes those things happen? Let's take a look. First question we have, what are official and informal languages? When we look at official languages, these are government or languages typically used by a government, usually to pass some kind of laws or enact legislation. They may use it for conducting public business. It may be specifically used in schools or by the public schools of that country. And when we look at English, just using that as an example, it is the official language in 56 countries around the world. All right, now we already talked a little bit about English. We know that the United States does not have an official language, right? English is not the official language, but it's one of the most predominantly spoken languages here, obviously. When we look at a working language, we get into the idea that this is kind of designated by an international organization or corporation, and it's as its primary means of communications. And so, like the United Nations has chosen 6 official languages, which are their working languages of Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. The European Union recognizes 24 official and working languages all throughout Europe. All right, so again, the difference here between official and working, very similar. All right, but usually working is that organization that has chosen it versus a country. Here is English-speaking countries around the world. You can see if it is blue, it is kind of the de facto national language. It means it has not been selected as a national language. And then the purple ones are official languages, national languages. All right, and so what we can see here is obviously the diffusion of English, and we can see basically where the United States and the United Kingdom have made their presence felt around the world. All right, that's where we kind of see a lot of these purple ones. Were at one point former colonies of England, or you can see, it's tough to see, there's not a whole lot of them out there. You can see some of the dots out in the Pacific Ocean. Some of those are U.S. related there too, and in the Bahamas and some of those areas there too. Dominica. So continuing on, looking at languages of the European Union. Again, here's all the different languages of the European Union, and we're looking at language families basically, right? You have the Indo-European families, you have the other families that are all recognized by the European Union here too. So what are informal languages? All right, new languages are created by mixing multiple languages together, usually English becoming mixed with other languages is what we talk about when we look at informal languages. And so 3 of the big English mixed languages here are Franglish, Spanglish, and Denglish here. And so Franglish is mixing French and English together, and you might see some words that, if you look at the McDonald's picture there, entree and McDrive, right, would be your mixing of those words together. Obviously, a lot of French people dislike English influence in their language, but a lot of words have been created to kind of prevent some of that English infusion over time in French. When we look at Spanglish, we're talking about the mixing of Spanish and English, and a lot of words are converted or partly converted into their Spanish forms, and it's pretty widely accepted when we look at English being an influence in Spanish and in Spanglish here. And so if you look at the picture on the far right there, it says "keep tranquilo" and "habla Spanglish." Right, so definitely a mix of Spanglish with the word, and then English and Spanish in there as well. And we look at Denglish. Denglish is mixing of German and English, and so we usually see that kind of used to simplify some of the longer German words and phrases there. So you can see that parking sign there, which Mitarbeiter, we're looking at parking for the restaurant only, essentially, is what we're talking about. One other informal language is something we see that's mixed English as well, and that is Pidgin language. Pidgin is basically a group of people that may speak this have learned English or maybe another lingua franca. It doesn't even have to be English necessarily, and they've kind of simplified that language so that they can understand it easier. And so there is no native speakers of Pidgin necessarily, but it's spoken in addition to someone's native language. And so it's kind of coming into contact with another language and simplifying that language down so they can understand it and speak it easier. So we look at some of our other examples of Spanglish, Franglish, and Denglish here from around the world. Again, adding in English into those other languages. And then we get into some of the differences that we start to see with the idea of dialect. All right, when we look at different dialects of English, we tend to think of like the dialects of maybe throughout the United States. But obviously, English is a global language, and so we hear dialect differences from different parts of England and the United Kingdom to Australia to India to all around the world where English is spoken. And so we look at this dialect as some kind of regional variation of the language. And there's usually some differences in spelling or vocabulary or pronunciation. And so when we talk about the dialects being identified through word usage patterns, we call that isogloss. Isogloss is a word usage boundary. So in certain parts of the world or in certain areas, regions, certain words might be used in a language, and in other parts of that regions nearby, they may use different words and dialects. All right, and so when we look at dialects, can kind of be designated as the standard language as well, and we'll get more into the idea of standard language. We talk about English dialects existing throughout the world. Different countries, again, different regions in the United States have different dialects. Different regions inside the United Kingdom have different dialects as well. So if we look at like some of the British dialects, we get to the idea of like Northern or East Midland or West Midland or Southwestern or Southeastern, and it matters where you live on how you sound. And we know that in the United States, right? People from the South versus people from the north have different accents, different dialects. We use different terminology. We use different spelling sometimes. We use different pronunciation on things. And so we'll take a closer look at maybe what your dialect is like. Okay, and then it would depend on where you're from in the U.S. So we look at the differences between British English and American English. Those are maybe the two most pronounced differences here when we look at the two inside English. Obviously, number one is vocabulary. There are new objects and experiences that lead to new words being created. And the United States has created words in the English language that didn't originally exist there. And so that has led to different vocabulary. We also see the difference in spelling. And so the person that is really responsible for changing the spelling of a lot of words in American English is actually Noah Webster. And his name should be familiar to you because he created Webster's dictionary. And when he did so, he changed some of the spellings of words, like you can see in our picture in the lower right down there, the word color. In America, we use C-O-L-O-R. But in Britain, they have a U in there for the word color. And so Noah Webster did this intentionally. He was trying to create a national identity for us, which kind of would alter the way we spelled things versus British English. We also get to pronunciation. Those are our three big differences when we talk about dialect. Pronunciations, obviously, our differences have resulted because we have not been influenced as much by British English over the last couple hundred years, right? It's this idea of isolation and other outside influences changing the way we say things. All right, and so when we come to that, you can see in the lower left too, we wouldn't call that a rubbish can, right? We would probably call that a garbage can or a trash can, where in Britain they might call that a rubbish can. All right, and there's all kinds of differences that we can talk about. And here's just some of the examples here of British and American English when we look at just an automobile, just a car. All right, we call it gas or gasoline. They call it petrol. All right, when we're talking about a place to park a car, right, a parking lot, we call it a parking lot. They call it a car park. All right, so all kinds of differences here. We call it the hood of the car, where you're going to lift the hood to get to the engine. They call it a bonnet. Right? So there's all kinds of differences when we look at these dialect differences between British English and American English. So earlier I said we'd get to standard language. We talked a little about that. But the idea of standard language is this is usually a variant of language that is a country's political and intellectual elite that have kind of promoted that as the main form or the standard language that's being used in school, in government, in the media, wherever it happens to be. Public life in general, they tend to stick to this standardized pronunciation and standardized language that's been created in that place. And so some examples of this when we look at in Irish, in Ireland here, we look at Gaelic as being kind of the example. Most government employees must pass an exam in Gaelic in order to actually become a member of the government. We look at some of the other ones here. Great Britain here, we see British received pronunciation. They call it King's English. It's basically the English that's used in London, or the dialect that's used in the capital city of London. We look at France. The standardized language is in Paris. and China is Beijing, and so on. You can see that countries, a lot of times where the capital or the major city is, that's where their standardized language comes from. All right, they're all using standard language, and it usually comes from a place of authority. It's coming down from usually a capital or a major city, like what we see here. So here's some of your dialects of the United Kingdom. And so you can see in medieval languages, you had Old English, right, which is the kind of brownish area, and the other areas were Celtic. And over time, we've seen a change. If we look at C there, you can see kind of what the projected future dialects look like, where you've got, obviously, a lot of the northern here. You've got a change from what we have today with some of the changes with the Midlands. And then you've got the southern language, which is kind of becoming more prevalent in other parts of England, or will become more prevalent here in the future. And you can see London is inside that southeastern portion there, and so that's where we get the standard language as well. So just looking at English in general, English can be a very tricky language, especially for English language learners. And if we look at this, like this sign probably sums it all up, right? If the GH sound in enough is pronounced F, and the O in women makes the short I sound, and the TI in nation is pronounced SH, then the word GHOTI is pronounced like fish, right? And so again, that's the idea of language being a fairly difficult language, or English, you mean, being a fairly difficult language to learn. So getting into more dialect and looking at the United States here. All right, we want to look at home and see what we're talking about. And so when we look at dialects in the U.S., obviously the original dialects basically were shaped by the early settlers on the East Coast. And so we've got three areas that basically are kind of cultural hearths, not just for language, but we talked a little bit about the cultural hearth and development over time from the East Coast. And so when we look at that, we've got New England, which was shaped by England specifically. We've got the Mid-Atlantic states, which were shaped by Germany, Sweden, and Ireland. And we've got the southeastern states, which were shaped more by the lower class English people who came over at that point. And so when we take a look at the modern American dialects, it's most noticeable in the East. We also see it's pretty prevalent and noticeable with Western settlers as well, coming from the Mid-Atlantic. And we'll take a look at that here in just a second. Okay. But obviously, a lot of different languages, or dialects, I should say, of the English language come from these different regions of the U.S. And so here's kind of our example here. You can see where the southeastern variation of dialect comes from versus the Midlands versus the northeastern. And we can kind of extrapolate that and spread that all the way across the country, where that's where the dialects tend to come from, is from that East Coast right there. And so there you go. If you extrapolate it all the way out, they use different colors here, but you can see that our northern dialect here is similar. It doesn't sound the same, but it's similar to, say, New England, right? Whereas that Midland kind of worked its way all the way across the country here, you can see, and then you've got that southeastern that continued to work its way across. And again, you've got other little dialects that have popped up here as well, right? The north dialect versus the north central is slightly different, right? Think of the movie, if you've ever seen the movie Fargo, right? Or you're kind of stretching out and maybe speaking a little bit more slowly, and some of those Minnesota, that's where we get the idea of kind of the north central. And obviously that's going to be different than East New England, right? Different pronunciation and different dialects, but it's similar from those areas there. And you can see the West has developed a little bit more on its own. And so this is probably one of my favorite maps. In fact, it's up in the classroom here as well. But if we look at it, pop versus soda versus Coke versus soft drink maybe, or other. But you can see, depending on where you are in the country, if you want to order, for us, if you want to order a pop, you would order a pop if you were here. But if you were in different parts, if you were, say, in southern Florida, you would have to order a soda. Or if you're on the East Coast or the West Coast, probably have to order a soda so they know what you're talking about. But this is kind of the interesting one. If you're down in, say, Louisiana or parts of Texas, you might have to order a Coke. All right, so this is always kind of an interesting one. And the reason why I look at this as being kind of a fun one is because in our household, between Mrs. Starr and myself, we always have this pop versus soda, because she comes from the Milwaukee area, which if you look on the map there, eastern Wisconsin, they use the term soda. And obviously here we use the term pop. And so I'll always say something about a pop, and she'll say, "You mean soda?" And I'll say, "Nope, we're in Minnesota. I'm talking about pop." All right, so it's kind of an interesting one. There are a few interesting dialect differences between eastern Wisconsin and Minnesota, which we don't usually think about. But the eastern Wisconsin area has developed a little bit more similar to the East Coast, New England area. And then, of course, we've got Minnesota. This is always a hot button issue in our household as well, because you can see if you're from Minnesota, you probably played the game Duck, Duck, Gray Duck, but we are legitimately the only place in the entire United States that plays the game Duck, Duck, Gray Duck. Everyone else plays Duck, Duck, Goose. All right. Why is it a gray duck? I don't know. My wife always says, "What exactly is a gray duck?" And I say, "It's a goose." I mean, because that's what it is. But I don't know. I don't know where the term gray duck came from originally, but that's what I grew up with. I'm sure that's what you probably grew up with, or some of you anyway, as well. So if we look around a little bit more, some of the other dialects found throughout the United States, we get into African-American English and African-American vernacular English. And so when we look at African-American English here, English dialect has been heavily influenced by some of the heritage of the forced migration that happened in the United States in the South, right? So we look at the forced migration of slavery, people being forced to come into this area and the southern areas, southern states, and they brought obviously their culture and those ideas with them. And so they were able to preserve somewhat of a distinct dialect. They kind of communicated with each other almost in a code, so that the masters and other people couldn't understand what they were saying. And so words like jazz and gumbo have actually diffused into the English language, which came from this original African-American English that was used as kind of a code amongst people. And then you can see African-American vernacular English is the official name that's given to preserve the African-American English that was brought here. And so you can look at it. It is controversial among some people, even in the African-American community, because there are people in the African-American community that say that this prevents success and affluence. It is a way of preserving the culture and the legacy, to use the terms and some of these different shorthands that are still used today by some people. But again, some people say that does prevent them from sounding affluent and speaking what people would refer to as maybe proper English or proper American English. Another dialect that we see in the United States is Creole, and this is not just in the United States, it's other parts of the world too. It's not necessarily a part of a language, but it is kind of the mixing of a colonizer's language with the indigenous language of the people that were in that area. And most of the time, those people are being dominated by the colonizing people. And so when we look at it, it's classified as a separate language because it has some differing aspects from the original language. And so some really good examples are French Creole in Haiti and Spanish. So in French Creole in Haiti is the number one when we look at it. We also see Creole can kind of exist specifically in kind of the Louisiana area. We hear about that a lot of times. Other examples, we have Spanish Papiamento in the Netherlands. We have Portuguese Creole in Cape Verde and in Africa. And so we see that this exists obviously in other places too. And again, Creole is kind of a catch-all for mixing the indigenous language of those people with the colonizer's language. All right. So when we look at dialect versus language, it can get a little fuzzy sometimes. And so when we talk about dialects, eventually over time, if they are prevalent enough and they're isolated enough from the actual language, they will become their own language. And so when we look at this, there are some distinguishing ideas between dialects and languages, and it can be difficult. So dialects of a language should have usually mutual intelligibility to each other. So again, they have to be different if we're talking about a dialect becoming a language. And some languages in the same family might have some kind of mutual intelligibility as well. And so they have to have something in common, basically, and eventually kind of split off into a new language. And so examples that have happened here is we look at Catalonian. When we look at in Spain, some of the different regions there speak Catalan. We look at Galician in Spain and Portugal, or Moldovan in Romanian. And you can see actually in Italy, there's all kinds of different dialects that have started to kind of develop into their own language as well, which you can see in the map in the lower right there. All right. And so a lot of times what this is an area that may be seeking some kind of freedom from the rest of the part of their country because they don't have the same similarities that the other people that speak the other language might have. And so those dialects have altered some of the makeup of those countries. Here's a green slide for you, so make sure you add it in. Remember, that's not in the book. So when we talk about languages and we talk about divergence versus convergence, and so when we talk about convergence, it's the collapsing of two languages into one from kind of a proximity. So being close to each other, two languages becoming melded together. And so when we look at it, the best example is in Malta. English and Maltese are currently being mixed together to kind of form an Inglese, I guess. I don't know what you'd say or what you'd call it. When we look at divergence, this is when a new language is formed due to lack of spatial interaction. So if you are isolated from someone else, your language has changed over time. And so through isolation, different dialects become separate languages, which is kind of what we just talked about, right? Like the idea of Portuguese eventually, which originally was part of Spanish, but because of isolation became its own language in the Romance branch. And so there's your idea here of some of the dialects of Spain, which we just talked about here, right? You've got that kind of eastern portion of the country being Catalonian, which is an area that we'll talk about when we get to political geography that they may seek to leave parts of Spain here. All right, they may want to become their own country because they have vast differences, not just with language, but with other aspects too, which we'll get more into. We also look at more here of language divergence. Again, this is the idea of the entire Iberian Peninsula having similar language background, but developing so much differently that they have kind of broken away from each other. Again, Portuguese becoming its own language, Catalonian starting to become its own language here as well. Finally, we look at the connection between language and political organization. And so talking about kind of the organization of political space and the creation of borders, there tends to be a very high correlation between language and the organization of space, so the border of a country. And so an example here is Europe. Most, but not all, but most of them, their political borders are cutoffs for different languages and even different language families. That's not always the case, but in Europe it tends to follow that idea. We just looked at Spain, which obviously doesn't follow that theory or that idea here. But the Romance language, basically, or Romance branch, dominates at least 5 of the countries in Europe. And so when we look at the map here, you can see the language families tend to follow borders here. Again, there are some differences. Like we said, Spain has seen differences with Basque and Catalan. And there's even a little bit like the northwestern corner of France there is Breton versus French. But again, for the most part, you can see that it does follow the language families for the borders of those countries. All right, so when we talk about some of the issues that may arise with language and countries, one of the big issues that may come up is the idea of countries that are multilingual. They have multiple languages in the country. And there are 4 really good examples of this. Obviously, there are other countries that are multilingual, but when we look at these as kind of being more like official languages. Belgium has 2 official languages. They are French and Flemish, and the 2 regions are very basically semi-autonomous from one another, Wallonia and Flanders. In fact, they probably would like to, because of these differences culturally and the differences with their language, they would probably like to or prefer to be 2 different nations. But it's really expensive to break a country apart. We've kind of talked a little bit about that. And so we look at Wallonia versus Flanders, the 2 regions that speak different languages. And it's created a lot of conflict and separatism between the 2. All right, they don't really get along real well. Switzerland's another really good example. They have 4 official languages in Switzerland: German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And this helps. It has helped, I guess you'd say, in Switzerland because Switzerland has de-emphasized the central government. And so they have kind of regional governments that are stronger than the centralized government in their country, and they are able to perform those duties of the government in those separate languages in those separate regions. Canada is another good example. There has been a lot of issues over Canadian history here between French and English, and actually there's a large following of people who speak indigenous languages there too. But we look at about a quarter of Canadians speak French, and most of those people live in kind of mainly the Quebec area. The government has made French mandatory in school and making sure that they continue to make it feel a little more like an official language. They can see the stop sign right there, both in French and English, but it has led to some feelings of separatism. And in fact, Quebec has attempted, or not attempted, I should say, but have thought about the issue of maybe splitting from the rest of Canada at different times in history. Our last example we have is Nigeria. There is 529 distinct languages in Nigeria, and only 3 of them are spoken by 10% of people or more. All right, so you can see that they have a lot of different multilingual issues that could arise in Nigeria too. All right, so we just look at some of these maps here. Here's your Flanders and Wallonia in Belgium. Again, it's very distinct, right? We talk about that isogloss here, the idea of that border between the 2 versions here, the Flemish versus the French being spoken here. Here's a little bit more with your Belgium multilingualism and how it's created some problems. You can see a lot of the advertisements, a lot of the signs are done in multiple languages, especially around the border of those 2 languages. You can see that on the top picture that one of the languages has been spray painted out. So again, the tension is fairly high amongst those people. Here's your multilingualism in Switzerland. Again, multiple signs, multiple languages on those signs, I should say. And you can see that the language tends to fall near the border of those countries. So French near France, German is a little bit more widespread, Italian versus Italy, or near Italy there. And then you've got Romansh kind of sprinkled in there as well. Here's your multilingualism in Canada, and you can see this is kind of a zoomed in picture of the Quebec area, and the purple area is where we see 89% and higher of people that speak French. But again, you can see that there's other people near and around Quebec that also speak French as well, just not as high in numbers. All right, but that is where we see the majority of French speakers in Canada. Then we look at multilingualism in Nigeria. Same thing. Again, you can see all the different languages being spoken there. And you can see that more than 1 million speakers of each of these languages that are listed here in the colors is what we see here. So lots of people there. Nigeria is a very quickly developing country. Their population is increasing quite a bit. And so you can see the amount of different languages there increasing too, or the number of people anyway. So one of the last big things we have to get into, guys, is looking at how do languages become endangered or extinct over time. And when we talk about this, an endangered language, the United Nations estimates there's about 2,300 languages that are near becoming extinct. And when we talk about extinct languages, there's only about 367 that have become extinct since 1950, which is still a lot. And so when we talk about one of the big examples here, the Gothic language in 3rd century Europe has since become extinct. Speakers were converted to other dominant languages over time, and major languages are still being overtaking minority languages today. So when we talk about cultural issues or local or folk culture being lost to popular culture, it works with the idea of language here too. And so there are about 300 languages that are safe from extinction, meaning there are enough people that are speaking those languages that it's not going to be threatened or endangered at any time. And so when we look at the little chart there on the bottom, you can see broken down kind of by region of the world, the number of languages that are either dying or in trouble in those places. All right, so that's a little bit different look than the endangered. When we talk about some of the languages which will be endangered, we're starting to look at languages a lot of time of native speakers to small regions or small places around the globe. A lot of them are Pacific Island languages too. So there's our map of endangered languages versus extinct languages. And so a lot of them, again, like we said, a lot of native speaking, Native American languages, a lot of natives to different parts of the world here as well, where we're seeing endangered or extinct languages. We also have isolated languages. And when we talk about isolated languages, we're looking at languages that are really unrelated to any other language that's out there. And so Basque and Icelandic are 2 really good examples of this. When we talk about Basque, which we mentioned a little earlier, it's in the northern portion of Spain right there, between Spain and France. And this is a language that actually predates the Indo-European languages. So that entire tree that we look at with Indo-European languages, this language existed before those other languages in that tree. And they've become very isolated because they're in the Pyrenees Mountains right there between Spain and France. And so that language has survived in that culture because of the isolation between Spain and France. Icelandic is the same. Obviously, being an island, Icelandic has developed over time in its own. It is a member of the Germanic branch, but it's really changed very little over time because it has little contact with other languages and outsiders to that island. Obviously, they have tourism and people come in, but there has never been a group of people who have come and settled in that area culturally that have changed the languages of Icelandic. There's some of your Basque protesters. We talked about some of the issues with Catalan in Spain. Well, there's some issues between Spain and the Basque region as well. A lot of them feel that their identity is not Spanish, so that they don't really think they should be a part of Spain. And so a lot of conflict has arisen between the Basque people and the Spanish as well. And then here's your idea when we look at Icelandic language being isolated. Again, there is the Icelandic. All right, it doesn't look similar to anything we see in a lot of our language here, right? But they have the English on there too for people who specifically are visiting or tourists. So what languages overall are being saved or preserved is a big question here. And so we look at, there's a couple of good examples. Number one is Celtic. Celtic was the former language of the British Isles. If we go way back, we saw that on one of our maps earlier. Today, it's spoken in more of the remote areas of Ireland and the United Kingdom, which you can see on our map there, where it's spoken mostly. This does include Irish, Scottish, Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. So it's kind of a large, it's an umbrella term for a number of different dialects here that are spoken that are Celtic. And so what they've done and how they've preserved it is the government has taken care to make sure that this is being used in government, it's being used in education, and that has allowed them to be more successful in preserving Celtic in general. And so it's used on TV, it's used on road signs, again, it's used in school or public schools as kind of one of the main languages. So they have been able to preserve that language over time. A couple other examples of languages that have been revived. We look at Hebrew. Hebrew was a language that was very close to being extinct prior to 1948, and it was the language of the Christian Bible and of Judaism. Right? It came from the Hebrew people in Mesopotamia, and over time, those people were spread out in other parts of the world. And after is the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, when a lot of people came back, we see a lot of movement and migration back to Israel during that time. We see the language was revived. New words had to be created for new technologies and new ideas that obviously didn't exist when Judaism and the Christian Bible were the kind of the forefront of Hebrew. We also look at down here, another good example is the Miami Native American tribe. And this is Miami of Ohio, not Miami, Florida. But this is a group that basically the language is nearly extinct. And it was brought with them when they were forced to migrate to Oklahoma. So we look at another forced migration here. And they were the last native speaker of it actually died in the 1960s. But there was a member of the tribe who taught his children how to speak this language as their first language. And over time, because of that, they have been able to basically save this language. And one of the things that he did, that's actually him in the picture there, one of the things he did was to help to create an online dictionary so other people could learn the Miami language as well. So he kind of single-handedly saved this language from extinction. There's some of your signs around Israel there. You can see the Hebrew on there. You've actually got three languages there. You've got Hebrew, Arabic, and English on those signs. We also see that there are new languages being found around the world, and there's a couple of good examples here. Koro Eka, was a language of northeastern India that has about 1,500 speakers, and this was discovered in the last few years. It actually belongs to the Tibeto-Burman branch of the Sino-Tibetan family, and it was found in kind of a village in northern India, northeastern India. Again, very few speakers, but in that village they have this distinct language. And then we look at the other one down here as the Warlpir Rampaku, which is from the Australian Northern Territory. And you can see the small village there on the map where this is found. There's only about 350 speakers, and it has a village. The village is about 700 residents, so not even the entire village speaks this language. But the young people kind of created the language by speaking to children in kind of a combination of 3 different languages. So it's almost kind of a version of Pidgin, kind of bringing multiple languages together. But the children combine these languages into an entirely new language. So the young people of that village mixed together a lot of the different languages that they had used into one, basically. All right, so kind of an interesting aspect here of new languages being found and formed around the world still today. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure that you go through and get all your information here, and we'll see you again next time.